webinar to us today, the Technology, Risk and Gambling webinar series. Today, I'm delighted to welcome two other members of the technology addiction team to discuss a really interesting and always topical issue, duty of care. We're going to have a special guest moderator, one of the members of the technology addiction team, Dr. Sascha Callaghan. Sascha has joined us on one of the previous webinars and it was so successful that we can't wait to have her back again. She is a specialist in law and ethics at the University of Sydney in the law school, and she's an expert communicator on issues related to health, technology, ethics and law. She has extensive experience in policy writing, regulation, corporate and government advisory, and has written extensively on the topic of technology and ethical issues from a legal perspective. So she's a fantastic person to lead this conversation. She will be talking with our two panelists. Professor Alex Blaszczynski is co-director of the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic at the University of Sydney and another member of the technology addiction team. Alex will be familiar to many people within the gambling field, probably most people on this webinar. He is one of the co-authors of the Reno model, which laid out the foundations of responsible gambling back in 2004 and has been widely used to implement responsible gambling policies internationally. So I'm sure he'll be able to discuss some of these. I won't go into his many accolades otherwise. We're extremely excited to have Becky Harris join us as well from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Becky is a distinguished fellow in the gaming and leadership at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and she's an adjunct gaming law professor. She was the chair of the Nevada Gaming Control Board from 2018 to 19, which makes her extremely relevant to today's conversation, and she helped guide the board through numerous changes and controversial matters. She has been extremely influential in the field, and again, I'll keep her bio short so we can save time for the conversation, but we're extremely happy to have all of our expert speakers today. The format will be some brief introductory comments by Alex and Becky, then we'll hand over to Sascha for a moderated conversation. As always, please put all of your questions and comments in the live chat. We'll get to them if we can, although please feel free to chat amongst yourselves, and the speakers will be available to answer questions after the webinar as well if we don't get through everything today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Alex to give a brief introduction on his perspectives of duty of care.
Thanks very much, Sally, and it's great to be here. This is a very important issue. As a clinical psychologist of 30 years treating problem gamblers, I'm fully aware of the significant impact that problem gambling has on individuals and families and society in general. We also looked at the Reno model, which was a guidelines and principles in terms of collaboration between key stakeholders in achieving responsible gambling and harm minimization. Part of that was the decision to gamble is the individuals, but many people misinterpreted our statements to suggest that this was a matter of individual responsibility directed towards the individual. It raised the question basically of where does an individual's responsibility lie? Because we have a situation where gambling is a risk-taking activity where the statistical configuration of each of these particular games are in the favor of the operator. So inevitably the customer will lose and the operator gains, or vice versa. So it represents a unique position in commerce where the aim or the intention effectively is for one person to win money at the expense of the other. The other issue is that gamblers knowingly enter into a situation where there is a risk of economic loss. They hope to win, potentially expect to lose, but they know that there is a risk involved. At the same time, operators offer gambling in a highly regulated environment, but concurrently they offer incentives to continue gambling, loyalty cards, complimentaries, direct and indirect benefits, reserved parking, etc. And these financial benefits or marketing promotions are designed effectively to entice the gambler to continue gambling. So the operators work in a business model that encompasses promotion and encouragements. They recognize that gambling itself can lead to significant harms, and that they know that with the work of Paul Del Fabro and his colleagues, that and others in terms of some of the online accounts, you can in fact detect people who may be exhibiting signs of problematic gambling behavior or excessive gambling behaviors. So the question effectively really is that the operator is conducting a legal business which is sanctioned by the government, which derives taxation revenue. And the corporate responsibility looks towards a business that runs its organization with the idea of some positive effects on the consumer, society, environment, and economy. And we can see that through the mining industry, where there is environmental destructions, but at the same time, they try to provide reconstitution of the environment. And so with gambling, it's achieved through the provision of voluntary or mandatory codes of conduct, compliance with regulatory requirements to minimize harms. And that, of course, is contained within legislation and various acts that require operators to provide responsible gambling tools, information, and assistance. The duty of care, of course, relates to the notion of responsibility or an obligation to avoid actions or omissions of actions that could result in foreseeable harm. And this is where it becomes really quite interesting, because the notion of duty of care relates in part to negligence. It's an obligation to take reasonable care to avoid injury to another person where that injury or harm is foreseeable. And so in any particular claim of duty of care, you're looking at the defendant owing the plaintiff a duty of care, that there is a standard of care that applies, and that the duty must have been breached, and the breach must have caused some degree of harm. So next slide. There have been a number of cases which have set the principles in law in terms of individual responsibility, and this is at variance with the public health model or the clinical sort of domain, where the attention really is shifted towards the industry for providing a harmful product that leads to significant harm. In the Reynolds versus Katoomba case, Justice Spiegelman stated quite clearly that it was within the plaintiff's power to resign from the club. This was a problem gambler who disclosed that he was a problem gambler and requested the club to no longer provide any credit or to cash checks, but the club continued to do so. The principles that Reynolds provided, or Reynolds versus Katoomba provided, was in fact that the personal responsibility for one's own action to the club cannot be invested to the club itself. The key issue effectively was that the law was not intended to protect individuals from poor economic decisions. That matter went also to another case with Alexander Preston versus Star City. But here there was matters which extended beyond that, and there was a provision of alcohol, intoxication, and some potential negligence, and this matter now is going to trial. So this was different from the Reynolds case, which extended to negligence. Again, the principle of individual autonomy was reflected in the Ferrugi case. Again, common law view as to limits of legal responsibility for pure economic loss was not considered. And again, in another case where there was a failure to detect the person who breached a self-exclusion order, the judge in that particular matter said that, again, the venue, the casino, had provided sufficient provisions in place to detect people, recognizing that people could enter undetected, but argued that the plaintiff is the authors of his or her own misfortune. So in essence, a majority of these particular cases at law have indicated that one cannot abrogate the responsibility of the individual to engage in a risk behavior that may lead to economic loss. And part of the issue from a legal point of view is that it opens up the potential that any gambler could then argue that they had a problem controlling their gambling behavior and therefore take a private action against the private right of action against the casino to recoup losses. And that, I think, is where we are at the moment. Although I think that there is a trend towards the potential for negligence to come to the fore with improved detection or identification of problem gambling, algorithms and indicators. And then the question arises, is the casino liable for any economic losses of the individual? So I'll leave it at that for the moment. If there's any questions or comments.
I think we should hear from Becky, and we'll draw the lines of argument together after we hear Becky's thoughts on this complex issue.
Hi, Becky, you're actually still on mute.
Sorry, I had a computer glitch for a second there. I want to go ahead and give you an overview of what's happening in the United States right now. 1% of US adults have a pathological gambling problem, and that's about 1% of our population. They meet that criteria as outlined in the DSM-5. I think when you have a pathological gambling issue, it's beyond your ability to disengage from the activity. We have another 4 to 6 million people who would be considered problem gamblers. They don't meet the full diagnostic criteria for pathological gambling, but they meet more than one criteria for experiencing problems due to engaging in a gambling activity. And we have 8.4 to 14% of the adult population that meet the criteria for at-risk gamblers. And when you look at some of the asks for help from individuals, there were about 200,000 calls, texts, and chats received at our national helpline in 2019 for assistance with problem gambling. Though from a state perspective, and I mean the United States, not individual states, we have no federal funding to help with problem gambling. That's largely left to the individual United States. And as you're aware, each state has its own flexibility and public policy priorities to make decisions about how they want to allocate resources in their states. And so you see a broad spectrum of states that provide various types of resources and invest different types of amounts of public finances into those resources. For example, in the past year, some states have decided to start funding in appropriate ways or more appropriate ways for problem gambling services. So New Hampshire was once at zero. Now they fund 200,000. Virginia, who was once at zero, now uses 0.8% of casino revenue from their sports wagering that will be online soon, and 2.5% from sports wagering for problem gambling services. Tennessee had a budget of $200,000. Now they're expanding that to 5% of the privilege tax as their sports betting comes online. Illinois went from $1 million to over $6 million. Michigan added an additional $2 million to their fund, and even the District of Columbia now is seeing the value in providing some dedicated public resources for problem gambling. It's a challenge because as the gaming market grows, problem gambling experts are concerned that states aren't considering the potential harms that are caused by addiction. As you are aware, Nevada is the most mature gaming jurisdiction in the United States. And as such, we have a variety of different tools, some that have a public price tag in terms of public funding that's dedicated to problem gambling resources, and some that I think are smart methods for helping people who deal with challenges from gambling addiction that don't cost the taxpayers a significant amount of money. So we do have dedicated state funding for problem gambling. We also have nonprofit resources that go into problem gambling. The Nevada Council on Problem Gambling is a private nonprofit agency that provides a variety of resources. They have resources for family members who don't suffer from pathological gambling disorders, but have loved ones that do, and help strengthen them and give them access to different types of psychological counseling and resources, and how to deal with a loved one that suffers from an addiction. We've got some resources from our Department of Health and Human Services for treatment and for psychological services as well. In addition, the Nevada Council on Problem Gambling provides resources for employers or our gaming licensees to train all of their employees with regard to how to spot people who may be suffering from or may be at risk of suffering from a gambling disorder. And so they have trained hundreds of thousands of employees over the years in terms of how to recognize people who may need a break or a timeout from gaming. I think the Advisory Committee on Problem Gambling is kind of the watchdog. They're a public agency that is tasked with looking at emerging problem gambling challenges within the state. But I think the most interesting thing that Nevada is doing is their problem gambling diversion program that's run through our judicial system. So recognizing that somebody that suffers from problem gambling will eventually or could potentially interact with the Nevada judicial system. In 2009, the Nevada legislature allowed for a program for the treatment of problem gambling. So essentially, instead of sending somebody to prison or put them on probation, judges in Nevada now have the discretion to order counseling for those who are addicted to gambling, and they retain oversight of their recovery. A lot of advocates say that it's the most cost-effective way to deal with these types of challenges. It's more cost effective to the state than incarceration. It's a proactive way to get resources and treatment into the hands of people who suffer from gambling addiction. And so judges will get a commitment from the person that's entering into the diversion program that they will continue treatment and finish treatment. If they actually do, in fact, successfully complete their treatment, then their court filing is sealed. There's no record of the challenge that they have. They do have a requirement that they attempt to make restitution for any funds that were stolen or inappropriately misappropriated in terms of gambling. And I think that thinking outside of the box and finding creative solutions for people who suffer from problem gambling is an effective, proactive way to begin to help get resources into the hands of vulnerable populations and people who need them the most.
Thanks very much. Sorry, Becky, have you finished your talk? There was a long pause. Great, long enough.
Yeah.
So just before I bring Alex into the discussion, you've stressed in your talk that proactive measures are, important for dealing with problem gambling. But the measure that you've emphasised is gambling diversion programs once their addiction has become, so their problem has sort of become more acute, and they might now be sort of seen as having a pathological gambling problem, and they've come into contact with the criminal justice system. That hardly seems proactive. That seems that person's fallen a long way down by the time they come into contact with the criminal justice system. I would have thought that there would have been many opportunities prior to that disaster unfolding to have made contact with that person. What would you say to that?
I would say that I don't believe that that is always the case. I think depending on the circumstances of the situation, it might be that that's that person's first real intervention, and it's an opportunity to take somebody who has a problem, and rather than put them into the criminal justice system, it's a way to say, okay, you have a problem, let's get you into counseling. Because remember, counseling is a choice by the part of the person that has the problem. And if they refuse to get help, this is an opportunity to help them determine what types of choices it is that they have. They can continue to refuse treatment and go through the criminal justice system, or they can elect to recognize that they have some challenges that they need to work through, and they can elect to go through treatment and have some support built around them to help them overcome this problem. If we look at the slide that I provided, you can see that treatment really does work, and that it's effective. And this is just a way to divert people out of the criminal justice system and put them into a position of treatment, so that their ability to take care of their family, their ability to get employment, their ability to function in society is less at risk than it might otherwise be with regard to the interaction that they have with the criminal justice system. I'm not aware of a diversion program anywhere else in the world. And just for context, if you look at the 61,000 adults who are estimated to have gambling addictions or problems just in the state of Nevada, there is a very significant cost to our community. It's $38.5 million, and that's mainly in criminal justice and healthcare costs. And I think that things like this diversion court that help get people put back on the right track are productive. You know, the social cost to Nevada families is identified in terms of bankruptcies and divorce and crime and lack of employment. And as we're going through this global pandemic where there's significant unemployment and a lot of uncertainty, more and more people can potentially be at risk, which is why I think that as we look to find the right kinds of solutions and put the resources in the hands of both the state as well as the people who suffer from gambling addiction, that things like the diversion court are actually more productive than people spending time in a jail cell. And while we would like to have that interaction, that between treatment resources and potential patron with a problem much earlier, that's not always the way that it rolls out in real life. Certainly the employees in Nevada casinos are trained to identify who might be at risk or who might be developing a problem, but they're not certified psychologists that are able to make a diagnosis. So the tools that they have at their disposal is simply to recommend that they take a break from gambling, that maybe they go get a cup of coffee or they get a meal or go home and go to sleep and get some rest. I think one of the reasons that we continue to discuss this topic is that while we have some tools and we're continually identifying more productive tools, there's not really a productive way to identify, engage, and convince people who have predilection towards gambling disorders or who are suffering from a full-on gambling disorder from actually being put into treatment or being provided with these resources. So I think that rather than criminalize them, have them put in jail and cause further societal harm, providing things like the diversion court that we have here in Nevada is productive and proactive.
Thanks, Becky. I might draw Alex in at this point. So Becky's talking about a fabulous diversion program. It's certainly good that people with mental illness, or psychosocial pressures don't end up in jail. But the question that I was getting to with her earlier was, it's a long way to fall by the time you get to court. The jewel in Nevada's crown seems to be this court diversion program, but there are many ways in which people suffer long before they're in court for stealing, whatever it is that ends you up, with a criminal charge against you. I'm interested in what the possibilities are for intervention much earlier than that, and what you think the possibilities are for interventions with people whose, for example, marriages are falling apart, whose general health is suffering, for the other kinds of harm. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about the spectrum of harms, and what ways might be effective to assist people before they reach the point of absolute disaster where they're in court charged with a criminal offence.
I think Becky raises some important points, and many of what I agree with. It's a complex and highly charged, debatable situation in terms of duty of care and impaired control and the impact of excessive gambling. This first slide I showed was in terms of corporate responsibility, and that involves effectively governments providing the adequate legislation and regulatory controls over the provision of gambling and how gambling is provided, and putting into effect a requirement for responsible gambling measures to minimize harms. The operators then have to work within that particular regulatory consumer protection group. They need to avoid exploitation, but we know effectively that the commercial imperatives are to make profits. So there's a tension there between government taxation, industry profit, and negative consequences of gambling. I agree fully that there should be a public health review approach to it in terms of looking at what are the factors that contribute to problem gambling, minimizing any unfair inducements, minimizing advertising, exploitation, targeting vulnerable groups and children and so forth. That's not in dispute. I think that there needs to be more funding allocated towards providing treatment services and assistance, not only for the gambler, but for the family and for others affected by it. The issue then is different from the duty of care issue, which is based on the notion of impaired control. And it's reflective to go back to the 1980 DSM-3 definition of pathological gambling, which was an inability to resist the urge to gamble. That then led Alexander Lafferty, who embezzled some $300,000, and this was reported in the Connecticut Law Review, and he argued that there was a diminished responsibility on the basis that he had an inability to resist the urge to gamble. That led to DSM-3 revising that to a failure to resist the urge to gamble. Now, we know that with addiction, people do have intense difficulty, particularly when they're exposed to certain situations or under emotional conditions, to engage in their particular behavior. But the law itself is quite interesting in looking at it from a different perspective. And in these particular case matters, the judges reference to the fact that a person had a problem gambling condition did not extend so far as finding that in some way he had been deprived of the ability to control his own actions.
Yeah.
So it's quite clear that what we're looking at from a legal point of view is the one of individual autonomy or capacity to make decisions. And in Spiegelman's case, he said that there were alternative opportunities for the person to control his gambling, such as giving up the membership of the club or not attending the venue, entering self-exclusion programs. And so the question is, to what extent does the operator have an obligation to identify someone with a gambling problem, and what steps can they do to do that, to intervene and reduce the particular problems? And my view is that from a moral and ethical perspective, industry should work towards actively and proactively identifying problem gamblers and minimizing harms. But again,
So I might just weigh in there, Alex. Just so my expertise is in law. I'm a lawyer, and I mean, really, so questions about diminished responsibility and so on really arise in criminal law. They don't have a place in tort law, and there is no defence of mental illness, for example, in tort law. Tort is a very, very limited doctrine, and so there's been a few questions about this from people who are watching this webinar, and they are interested in where duty of care arises. So duty of care, as you've mentioned, is a concept that arises in negligence, and there will be situations which will generally be unsuccessful, where people who have suffered harms, gamblers have suffered harms, have attempted to bring an action in tort and to claim that the operators of a gambling institution, organisation, have been negligent and have negligently caused them harm. But that is always going to be extremely difficult for anybody making that claim in negligence, because of the voluntary assumption of risk. And demonstrating a lack of voluntariness in law is, I mean, if you are conscious and you're doing it, even if you're floridly psychotic. So this is kind of an area that I've looked at in other contexts, even when people have sort of, stepped in front of a bus because they've been suicidal, and the driver of the bus has suffered PTSD. That person's still being held responsible for that action, despite the fact that they're literally floridly psychotic, because they knowingly did it. No one forced them, no one had a gun to their head, they did it. So someone with something as sort of amorphous as a gambling problem, even before it gets to addiction, it really has no chance of arguing that their actions aren't voluntary. So what that really boils down to is that the common law is not sufficient to provide a solution to the harms that arise for problem gamblers. It's just forget about it. I mean, really, what we need to do as a community and as policy experts is to develop a legislative formula like any other, smokers don't claim in negligence against big tobacco companies. Manufacturers of goods are held to certain standards, and it's really, it's up to people like us to develop legislative frameworks to deal with these complexities, because the common law simply isn't developed to address the claims and the harms that accrue to people who have gambling addiction issues. One other thing that I thought was interesting, reading Becky's paper about the Nevada legislative structure, and I think this is interesting too in relation to your paper, Alex, the Reno responsible gambling paper, is that so it looks as though the Nevada framework was it does not have a public health flavour. The flavour to it is a way of supporting the gambling industry and to protect against harms to the extent that it's necessary to do so for the public to tolerate the industry. So it's very much focused on industry protection, and it does seem that even the obligations to reduce harm are minimal. They're there to the extent that it is necessary to allow the industry to function, and without the public, having a heart attack over the harms that sort of happen and throwing them out of town. Your paper as well has an assumption that there are benefits associated with gambling, and that it's sort of it's certainly not a sort of an abolitionist model, far from it. I was wondering if either of you would like to comment, or in fact both both of you could comment, perhaps starting with Becky, about the challenges of introducing a genuine public health model when clearly everybody involved in policy is very concerned to keep the industry on board. And in Nevada, it's actually very much part of Nevada's livelihood. So that would seem to mitigate against genuine public health strategies. What would you say to that, Becky?
I think that the overview that Nevada caters to the industry at the expense of the community and gambling patrons is a little overly simplistic. I think you have to better understand what's actually happening in Nevada. We have a lot of challenges here. We're 3 million people. We have a budget of $1 billion annually. We are 48th out of 50 with regard to healthcare. So we have a hard time getting doctors, psychologists, and other healthcare professionals into this state to be able to provide treatment for run-of-the-mill general doctor issues, let alone dealing with more complicated addiction type issues. In fact, we are one of the hardest hit states in the US with regard to COVID, and we just had a recent special session where there were significant budget cuts. The legislature was forced to determine what their priorities were going to be, and one of the suggested cuts was a 75% reduction in problem gambling funds. But the legislature wanted to make that a policy priority, and while we didn't get 100% funding restored, we got a significant portion of that funding restored because from a legislative perspective and a public policy value perspective, maintaining funding for problem gambling is important in state government and within our community here in Nevada. And so we're just a resource poor state and have difficulty attracting the right types of healthcare professionals to really engage in any kind of comprehensive public health type policy. We would love to do that if we had the money to do that. We don't have the money to always be able to fund everything we want to in a good year, let alone in a situation right now where we're just being decimated by the global pandemic. So I think that the intention is there. I think the political will is even there. And Nevada licensees are very concerned about making sure that their patrons are healthy and safe, both physically and psychologically. The challenge in the United States is that you cannot make a medical diagnosis if you don't have a degree in medicine or psychology, and asking employees such as cocktail servers or restaurateurs or slot operators or pit bosses or others to determine whether or not on the basis of behavior they're observing somebody suffers from gambling addiction is a step too far for the United States. We're not going to be diagnosing patrons within the casinos.
Do you think you can do that? So it seems like, you know, there's this huge world in between diagnosing somebody with a pathological problem to just noticing that they're not having a great night.
So we do
like same with drunks, you know, like people who are drinking alcohol, right, and responsible service of alcohol. So I'm sure that they exist, but I wonder if you could, just for people who aren't very familiar with Nevada, what other kinds of mechanisms and responsible gambling mechanisms are in place for the less acute presentations that don't require force. You know, it's not like people being sort of bundled out of there, but sort of, you know, what strategies are in place for people who are not quite at the ultra acute end of the spectrum, but might be sort of heading there?
So we have counseling not counseling, but training that's provided to all of the employees at a casino here in Nevada by the Nevada Council on Problem Gambling, in which they are trained to identify unhealthy behaviors, right? So if there's somebody sitting in front of a slot machine for 3 straight hours without a break, somebody is going to approach them and ask them if they would like to take a break. Would they like to get a beverage? Would they like to get a cup of coffee? Do they have somebody that they need to check in with at home? Do they need to eat or go to the bathroom, or, you know, those kinds of things? But, you know, you're limited by the willingness of the person that you're approaching to want to do that. But, you know, just for better reference, since 1999, since 1999, Nevada's had a self-exclusion policy. So in terms of advertising and engaging in casino activities, people are allowed to go in and self-exclude if they would like to do that. And there are board regulations at the Nevada Gaming Control Board that are effective on all licensees with regard to the types of self-exclusion policies that are in place. And there are signs and opportunities put in place by ATM machines and in visible places throughout the casino that if somebody thinks that they're having a problem or simply just wants to talk to somebody, they can call the national hotline or they can call Nevada Council of Problem Gambling. I'd love to share a story if you can indulge me. It's real quick that I just heard about yesterday. There was an individual who had overindulged in gambling in Louisiana and was literally on a bridge ready to take his life. And they called mental health services in Louisiana, and they had talked to him about as long as they could talk to him and could not talk him down off the ledge. Long story short, somebody thought to call Nevada, and they called Nevada for some mental health services. And because of the unique training and the expertise in gaming and the challenges that are associated with that, there was a happy outcome yesterday for that individual and his family because somebody thought to call the hotline in Nevada.
That's a great story. And we've just had some comments saying that intervention after 3 hours seems, I don't know that we see that here in Australia, for example. Alex, just before we run out of time, did you want to comment? Because I think it is one of the more controversial aspects of the Reno responsible gambling framework, is that, it's certainly industry friendly. Can you talk a little bit about the balancing act that is done there when you're working in this area?
First of all, I disagree with you in terms of it being industry friendly and it being incompatible with the public health model. The model itself is not designed to be prescriptive. We were looking at guidelines and principles. And the fundamental principle was a collaboration between government, industry, individuals, community, and society in general. We weren't focusing in terms of being prescriptive in terms of who should be doing what. We understand that the government is in a conflict situation between taxation, revenue, regulating, and gaining benefits, as is the industry, and then the community itself. Are the benefits to gambling? Well, I think the fact that 90% of people do gamble, there's a demand for gambling, and if you prohibition era indicated that there's a demand for gambling. So, I don't know what the excitement is in terms of gambling across many of these particular products, but it certainly does motivate people to engage in those particular behaviours. I think the issue effectively is, and you're quite correct in the sort of tort law, but the tort law is, I think, important in the sense of motivating the industry and the government to increase these particular initiatives to proactively intervene when they identify someone with a problem gambling. And certainly the trends, as I see it, in South Korea and also with the Christian Haynes case in Austria, that there's now contributory negligence between 50% contributed by the industry in failing to act and intervene, and 50% on the individual. My view is that as we move more and more towards putting pressure on the government and industry to legislate, that the industry has to actually proactively protect people that they know are problem gamblers or have indications that they are problem gamblers, then at that particular point in time, I think there'll be more positive actions and more funds and more resources allocated towards identifying and intervening with problem gambling. At the moment, there are guidelines. Someone sitting in front of a machine for extended periods of time, there ought to be proactive interventions there to ensure that the person is not a problem gambler and still having fun. So I think until legislation comes in, I think it's the same sort of approach with seatbelts. Initially, people argued that seatbelts weren't useful, that there were civil liberties, infringements, etc. And now it's become following legislation, standard accepted practices. And I think once there is legislation requiring industry to identify and monitor and deal proactively with individuals who are showing signs of problem gambling at the early stages of their career rather than later on. Again, people just don't develop problem gambling immediately. But having said that, it becomes then important because people have access to multiple forms of gambling, and a person may attend a casino and have no problems with casino gambling at roulette, for example, but spend many hours at the local tavern or club or hotel playing VLTs or slot machines. So it becomes then difficult to work out who is responsible for what. But clearly, if there is a problem gambler identified by a venue, then I think morally, ethically, and hopefully in the longer term legislatively, they have to act, and they have to act proactively, and a duty of care is imposed on this particular situation, as it is with alcohol, for example. Alcohol is much easier because you can identify someone who's inebriated, but it becomes more difficult in terms of a gambler identifying within a particular session whether the person's an excessive gambler. You can, in a club setting where the customer or the patron is known to the venue staff over a long period of time. And so I think that there are differences across different contexts. Certainly with horse racing, for example, if you're a non-account holder wagering, then it becomes difficult for the industry to identify whether you're a problem gambler or not, because it's a cash-based intervention. So I think it's complex, but I think, I agree fully with Becky that much more needs to be done in this particular domain, particularly funding and allocating services and trying to prevent people from developing problems. But currently, I think the law is still, I think, struggling in terms of the tort law, looking at levels of responsibility where someone does, as you rightly point out, if they're psychotic, there should be something in terms of legal response to that in terms of principles.
Yes, that's a long road for people working in this area in all sorts of domains. But that's why work such as both of your work is so important.
Just on that point, Sasha, if I can just intervene here, I've been in the field looking since 1977 when we started first treatment programs into problem gambling, and the difficulty we had in convincing both mental health workers, politicians, Treasury, Health Department officials, and the politicians that gambling was a particular issue and that more funding required for services. We had difficulty in convincing anyone until the 1999 Productivity Commission, and then that caught the industry on the back foot, and we've been trying to work towards achieving harm minimization since then. But I think it is a difficult road because there's a conflict of interest between the government, between industry, and many other key stakeholders. And that's where the tension, and that's where the sort of elephant in the room is actually not highlighted.
I have to say, coming just from outside this area, and my expertise is really mental health, technology, and law, and I'm new to looking at gambling. One of the things that really jumps off the page in a lot of the writing about this is the sort of philosophical and commercial conflicts of interest that are woven through getting the balance right. And I would have thought that there would be quite a diverse range of views about the best way of tackling these issues. But I do think, what Becky's outlined in Nevada is probably a long way ahead of, despite the challenges, a long way ahead of where other jurisdictions are, because there's, so much gaming. Becky, what would you have any concluding comments on the appetite of I guess maybe on the balance of those competing interests and the appetite of lawmakers and operators to contribute funding to management of some of these issues before it gets to the forcing acute phase, which is really where, you know, law bites, but sort of, you know, but before that.
Certainly. So in Nevada, the gaming operators spend an awful lot of money trying to figure out the problem gambling piece, because they're astute enough to recognize that they want customers who gamble responsibly and gamble, you know, on a fairly regularly, right? Not every day, but, you know, maybe once or twice a month, they're going to come in. They're not going to blow their entire household budget. They're going to responsibly enjoy gambling as a form of entertainment, and then they're going to go home and take care of the rest of their lives. Those gamblers who blow everything that they have and then are going home and don't have money to pay the rent, pay the bills, pay the doctor, are not the kind of patrons that they're seeking to have at their establishments in the first place. So it's in their best interest to make sure that, and they recognize that patrons are gambling responsibly. Nobody wants to see anybody devastate their life because they have an addiction that they can't control. So there's been a lot of research done, and right now with the way that our tax structure is set up, there's a portion of the slot tax that goes towards public funding for problem gambling in the state of Nevada. The licensees are quite proactive in making sure that they follow all the laws and comply with all the regulations that the Nevada Gaming Control Board puts out. And then the legislature is very, very responsive, as the last special session that they engaged in would demonstrate that they were willing to hear from people in the community about how important dedicated funding for problem gambling really was, and is and continues to be. What I want to leave you with, since we just have a few minutes and I know Alex is going to want to wrap up, over the past decade, more than 5,000 Nevadans received state-funded treatment addressing issues that extended far beyond conventional therapy. So they got help with financial issues, with employment challenges, with legal troubles, with divorce, physical health challenges, mental instability, and bankruptcy. Our beneficiaries of our public dedicated problem gambling funds were diverse. They were diverse in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, and age. And approximately 80% of those people who the new treatment enrollees were seeking help for the first time. And then it's interesting when you look at what those services actually broke down into. Nevadans who utilize these services face many challenges. 83% of the inpatient clients were unemployed, 33% lacked any health insurance, and 100% they struggled with gambling-related harm. So when you look at a whole individual from a holistic point or perspective, not only do they need help with gambling-related challenges, but they have a whole host of other resources that need to be packed around them to get them so that they don't have food insecurity, they don't have unemployment insecurity, they don't have housing insecurity. And I think that's where Nevada really excels, because those other resources are not factored into problem gambling when we look at how much is spent. And my final thought is it's a great investment to invest in problem gambling treatment, because you get a 100%, 200% return on your investment. For every dollar that's invested, you get $2 in societal good.
Thank you so much, Becky. It's so interesting to hear the amazing work that's being done by organisations in Nevada. Alex, before we sign off, do you have any concluding comments?
Yeah, look, I think we need to look at the complexities in terms of what are the factors that lead people to gamble, and try to direct resource allocations to preventing the onset of those particular problems. And this is where we're looking at the environment, where particular gaming machines are placed, what are the major forms of gambling, how to actually proactively identify and intervene with people at the early stages before they actually develop significant problems that require treatment or experience significant harms. And I think this is where the public health model comes in. Certainly in New South Wales, I'm on record as suggesting that gaming machines should be taken out of for-profit organizations such as hotels, and then relocated into clubs where there are memberships, there is more monitoring of individuals, and more concern in terms of responsible gambling as a corporate social responsibility. I think the governments need to start looking in terms of how they regulate the gambling environment. So what are the compliance issues? Do they have sufficient staff to oversee a lot of the practices that are going on? I think I agree with Becky that the majority of the industry people are moving towards that notion of corporate social responsibility and prevention. They don't want to see bad impacts of their particular products. They don't want the adverse publicity, and they want to avoid increasingly strict regulations. So I think that there are unfortunately some rogue elements in the industry that go for the maximum profit and bring detriment to those attempting to do the right thing. So unregulated offshore sites, they need to be eliminated. There needs to be greater reliance or legislated reliance on the industry to be proactive rather than reactive in terms of dealing with problem gambling.
Thanks so much, Alex. That I think is the end of our session. So I'm just going to hand back to Khalil to say goodbye to everyone.
Well, thank you very much, Sasha, and thank you, Becky and Alex as well. This was a really interesting talk about a very complex issue. And, for those of us who think very narrowly about, a set of academic problems, it's really helpful and reflective to think about the wider societal infrastructure that leads to the types of things that we focus on. Sometimes we wonder why, we don't see funding for this type of research or that type of research, but the things that Becky brings up about, the state of jurisdictional budgets and the things that Sasha and Alex both talked about duty of care and the nature of where liability stands and all these issues, you really start to understand, okay, why are we in the place that we're in right now? So this conversation was incredibly helpful for me to understand a lot of these issues and reflect on them more. So thank you all for joining us this week. Next week, Sally will be moderating an interesting session on gambling during and after the COVID-19 shutdown. So Sally's done some recent research, but she'll be, I think, weaving into her moderation duties as well. But speaking on this topic will be Steve Sharman of the University of East London, as well as Anders C. Hackinson of Lund University. They have both done work which I believe as of yet is unpublished. So they'll be talking about the trends and different themes that have emerged in their work. So that'll be an interesting conversation to listen to next week. So for this week, allow me to again thank the Brain and Mind Center at the University of Sydney for sponsoring this webinar, as well as Harrison Stein for all of his assistance on the back end with all the technical issues. And thank you again, Sasha, Alex, and Becky. This was a wonderful conversation. And for everybody that tuned in, hopefully we'll see you again next week.